Okay, so I think we're live, and this is a very late night or late night. You know how they have those shows, the late show and then the late show that's not only after midnight but close to 1 p.m. They usually slotted that for these distinguished slightly more news focused shows like Tom Snyder. Then they got British comedians who no one had heard of to to replace American late night hosts that were just as unfunny, like James Corden. But this is the YouTube version of that. I don't think there's anyone streaming now except for Adam Carolla and some of the West Coast people. So those of you who are insomniacs, welcome. But today I just wanted to talk, or tonight, or although it is the next day, I want to talk about the sports media, the woke sports media, which used to be just a small or minor portion of the overall sports media, and it's come to predominate so that it's not just ESPN, it's it's virtually every sports network and sports talk radio station and every host. And for those of you who still listen to radio, you'll notice this. If you listen to WFAN or ESPN Radio, which are the two main sports talk sports radio networks stations in New York City, you'll notice the constant drumbeat, the constant social justice or social just propaganda just drilled into your head. It really does resemble something out of an Orwell novel. And it's become it and it's an interesting turn of events because the people who watch sports, and Clay Travis from Outkick the coverage and Outkick the show, he made a really trenchant observation about this phenomenon, namely that there's a very little overlap between the woke community and avid sports fans. Now, that's not saying that there isn't some intersection. They're obviously, far left, even though it's a bit it's a bit of an aberration. There are far left, very hardcore socialists who watch sports, who are into spectator sports and watch football and baseball. They're not, and in fact, this is a much bigger phenomenon in places like Europe, the Middle East, where you have soccer as kind of this universal touchstone for for entire countries. They kind of unify around this. So you have these you have schisms between political factions that are reflected in clubs, different soccer clubs or football clubs, as they say overseas, and you have ultras or what we would call soccer hooligans, very fanatical, devoted followers of a particular soccer team that are drawn to one club or the other, and they'll often erupt into riots or violence. And you see this in places like the Ukraine, Poland, Italy, Spain, virtually every European country which has a soccer culture, and that is virtually every European country. You'll see different soccer fandoms reflect different um, political identities. So in Italy, you have clubs that are far left and socialists. And then on the opposite side, you have clubs that have a following that is reactionary and sometimes even fascist. And their rivalry is reflected in these games and the spillover effect they have. A great book about soccer, the psychology of soccer culture, particularly soccer hooliganism, is Among the Thugs by Bill Buford. It was written in 1990, so it's slightly dated. Some of the things are slightly dated. For example, British soccer hooliganism has kind of been supplanted by Russian and East European soccer hooliganism, but it's basically a good analysis of the psychological effects of taking part in this group activity that heightens tension and focuses all of your energy onto these increasingly corporatized, deracinated multinational conglomerates or corporations. And this was the process that was just starting to take off. This was before all of the soccer teams in the UK were bought by these Gulf Arab Emirates and sheikdoms, and you had Emirates air plastered all over their soccer uniforms. But this is just a long-winded way of saying that in sports overseas, particularly soccer, you do have these stark cleavages between the left and the right, sometimes between different ethnic groups, like in Turkey, or even different religions. But as far as the United States goes, we don't really have that culture. And people who are into sports, like I said, there are definitely liberals, but this sort of hyper sensitized, kind of performative, the sort of performative leftist you see on college campuses and increasingly in city council chambers. It's reflected in our political culture now, increasingly. You don't really see that, or you didn't in sports. I mean, of course, there are people who watch sports. They range, they run the gamut politically in terms of the ideological spectrum, all the way from far left to far right to apolitical people who don't care about anything other than sports. There's a great caller to WFAN, and they did a profile of this guy. I wish I could remember his name, but basically, he was suicidal. He almost starved himself, and not in the sense of anorexia nervosa. He just, there was a point where he was giving up on life, and the recurring theme was his devotion to the Green Bay Packers, and I think the Packers even flew him out to watch one of their games. But this guy, his entire life basically revolved around sporting events and the outcomes of football games, and it was somewhat it's an interesting story. It was kind of depressing, but my point is, you have people like that who aren't really finely attuned to the outside world and to political machinations, and are just obsessed with sports. But you also have people who have political opinions about these sorts of things. But what you're seeing now is the encroachment that the left has made into all of these other arenas, and you see it increasingly in little niche fandoms and communities, and you've seen this all the way through, in everything from comic books to fantasy, the fantasy genre of literature. Remember, there was that huge controversy over the Hugo Awards being won by all of these ostensibly right-wing novelists. And then you had, of course, Gamergate, which sort of broke open the culture war in these in these little niche communities. In this case, video gaming, and even classics. Mark Zuckerberg's sister, I think her name is Randy Zuckerberg. She has, as far as I know, she doesn't really have. She didn't have a career. She basically rode on the coattails of her brother's success and used it as an opportunity to try to destroy the classics and attack traditional Greek and Roman art and literature, because it was created by white men, and that is the worst is the worst possible thing you could imagine in among the people who have designs in reshaping or transforming Western civilization, but really just simply toppling it and pulling it down. But that was another cul-de-sac in the culture conf, attacking Homer and Virgil and Euripides and Aeschylus and all of the foundation of Western foundations of Western literature and art. So you had all of these. Hey, Alejandro, good to see you. You had all of these little mini conflagrations that were part of a broader cultural war, but increasingly the left and what you would call cultural Marxists were trying to take beachheads from these communities that were not overtly politicized, that were devoted to things other than the left's idea fix, whatever that was at the moment. And they saw it kind of like, I think a good analogy would be the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, for those of you who are familiar with World War II and what Douglas MacArthur did in order to defeat Japan. Obviously, logistically, it was impossible to just invade Japan. Just like it was difficult to launch a land invasion of continental Europe. So you had to go through North Africa, up through Sicily, and then eventually land on Normandy during the D-Day invasions. So what he did was somewhat similar. He used this strategy of taking back all of the possessions that Japan had seized and the Japanese Empire had expanded, just taking them back one by one. From the Battle of Midway on, just taking all of these things, Peleliu, the Philippines, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, until eventually you would get to the Japanese mainland. Oh, hi, Matthew. And that's kind of the left strategy. Instead of making a full frontal assault on all, just launching a full scale invasion, and deploying all of their resources. Devote they attack little beachhead. They attack little islands and try to establish a beachhead there. So um, since they already have control of these large cultural institutions like Hollywood and academia, they take over tiny bits of not even hostile territory, but neutral territory. Things like video games, um, fantasy or science fiction literature, and sports. Sports is, yeah, it's very insidious. Insidious. It's sports is the last or one of the last major outposts. I mean, sports um and something that Andrew Breitbart said is particularly relevant. He said politics is downstream of culture, and he made this argument in his autobiography, which was also kind of like a political manifesto entitled "Righteous Indignation." So his main theme was politics is downstream of culture, but also, and he didn't expand upon this because he wasn't he wasn't really a man of faith, but culture is downstream of religion. So a lot of people seem to think that the way we are now, it started in the 1960s when all of these neo-Marxists start and then represented by the New Left started to take over academic institutions, places like Columbia, Harvard, the Ivy League, NYU, on the West Coast, the University of California system. So they started to take over these institutions, started to establish control of of academia, and they think that's when it started. And it's not true. It started way back through before the progressive era, even when progressive Christianity started to encroach upon the church and undermine it. And this was years before you had the free speech movement in Cal Berkeley, years before you had Students for Democratic Society, and even before there was a real robust communist or socialist movement inside the United States. This could be traced back before the 20th century. And if you really want to go back, you can trace it all the way back to altering or trying to open up new contemporary translations of the Bible. So the Revised Standard Version of the Bible was published was published sometime in the mid to late 19th century. So, but even during then, you had liberals encroaching upon the church and trying to insinuate themselves into the church. So, it dates back more than a century. And then, of course, you had the progressive era where you had Wilsonianism, and Wilson's protege FDR during the New Deal. You had this stretch of the progressive era, which was interrupted briefly by Calvin Coolidge and Warren G. Harding, but it was just a blip. It was basically a tiny blip between 1914 and 19 and basically when Herbert Hoover was elected. So that small narrow window when progressive and left-wing ideas weren't ascendant. So you've had this long march through the institutions, and it began way before the 1960s, even before the progressive era, and it's just continued unabated, uninterrupted for over a century. And now what you have is like an island hopping strategy, which is just a mopping up operation. And uh, what you're seeing now in sports media is a reflection of that. And it's kind of interesting when you actually look at the people who are sports journalists. There are a number of explanations for this. One of them, and I think this applies to a lot of sports analysts and reporters. These are people who wanted to be quote unquote legitimate journalists, and that means people who were in newsrooms, either national political reporters or pundits or columnists, or at the very least maybe working the metro desk, reporting on quote unquote real news and shaping public opinion. And of course, they weren't able to do that. They see sports as sort of a kind of an inferior version of the journalism that they should be practicing, but are not uh, weren't deemed qualified to practice. So that breeds resentment, and you see that pour out into these uh, quests to be, to all of these performative exercises to demonstrate that they're anti-racist and they're anti-Trump and they're they're pro the American flag is America's is systemically racist and so on and so forth. Hi, David. So that's one portion of sports journalism, contemporary sports journalism. This large group of frustrated people who want to be real hard-hitting journalists or pundits. They want to they want to have an op-ed in the New York Times, but they couldn't quite make it. And this applies to people like this definitely applies to people like Michelle Beadle and all of these obnoxious sports pundits that you see. And another element which is less prominent, but also significant, are really hardcore ideologues. You have these people are basically Marxists. Now they may um, they may be fans of sports. Just because they're Marxist doesn't mean that they can't watch. Yeah, I'm in New York City. Can't be fans of the Lakers, even though the Lakers are the epitome of capitalism. But you know, yeah, these people are hardcore ideologues, and they see sports as simply another facet of society which they can colonize. Some people write um, lead stories for The Nation or Mother Jones attacking, uh, calling for defunding the police or reparations, and they look at their little sliver of the culture, i.e., sports, and they say, "Well, I can do the same thing. I'm just going to channel it into this area where I have some expertise or knowledge." Uh, so people like that, you would say, someone like Dave Zirin. He's a perfect example of that. For those of you who aren't familiar, he's the sports reporter for The Nation. Now, if you're a sports reporter and you have ambitions of success, if you have ambitions for success, you're going to want to work for maybe ESPN, maybe whatever, Sports Illustrated, even though that both of them are kind of going the way of the dodo, especially Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated is basically going to be a website with freelance bloggers paid. $35 an article in a couple of months. But that's neither here nor there. But the point is, like, you want to be the face of a flagship sports. You don't want to write for a sectarian leftist magazine that's printed on pulp quality paper, and be in the back. Like, that's not your. If you're really into sports and you want to be a successful sports journalist. But if you're a leftist, if you're a committed Marxist ideologue, then of course that's a perfectly acceptable venue. You wouldn't want to be on. I mean, you do spots on ESPN. They'll interview you when they want your opinion on a burning, manufactured racial controversy or controversy involving something that Kurt Schilling said on Twitter. But otherwise, you wouldn't that wouldn't be seen as something to be looked down upon. Like, you're a soldier uh, being deployed in the war uh, against the West and capitalism and America. Why? That's a good question. I don't know if they think that there's a place that's better than America. A lot of them, I think, don't understand what the country is going to look like once they are successful. I think they're very short-sighted. Um, just like a lot of the people that start these sorts of revolutions in places like Cuba or Iran, historically, they don't have a lot of foresight, and they're not perceptive enough to understand what's going to follow once they dethrone the Ancien regime. The NASCAR thing is kind of insane because if you listen to sports talk radio or watch sports, cable sports analysis, the way they're portraying this is kind of insane. They're saying, uh, NASCAR needs to get beyond its fans. These are all, these white rednecks, uh, good riddance. We don't want these people here. And the thing is, those are the only people that watch your sport. It doesn't make it. It's like it's like basically saying, you know, the manufacturers of Peloton, if they decided tomorrow to say, we're going to scrap all of our marketing campaigns, we're going to start insulting people with lots of disposable income, people that are interested in physical fitness, and we're just going to start marketing ourselves to uh, people who are not interested in exercise at all, people that never exercise, that don't care about their weight, and that don't have the resources to buy or I guess Peloton, you rent it. I'm not sure. I don't exercise myself, so I mean, I walk. I do. My exercise is walking, but so I don't know how Peloton works, but basically saying, like, if they said tomorrow, we're just going to tell all of the people, all of our devoted, yeah, Tess Holiday, all of our devoted customers to buzz off. And you disgust us. We're just going to market to people who are not interested in exercising at all and don't have the money to buy our exercise equipment. That's basically what NASCAR is doing with its fan base. They're not just saying we want to expand our fan base, which is, is understandable. Like, I mean, this is one of the reasons the NBA exposed itself as so just this disgusting kowtowing to China, because once you expand these markets and you become reliant on the money the revenue streams they provide, you have to they get to dictate what you do and what you say And uh, that's common. Like even Chick-fil-A is another good example. Uh, Chick-fil-A is another great example. Like they were founded on Christian values, and they became successful because of it, not in spite of it. And the boycott, the boycott launched against them uh, for supporting for opposing for supporting traditional marriage, that had no effect. In fact, they increased. But what did they do? They've become so successful now that their CEO feels the need to conform to the culture and the people that shape our culture and impose certain demands upon you once you reach a certain level of success. So, yeah, comics and video games. I talked about that a little bit. They've all kind of they've all kind of insulted. Comic books is a great example. They're basically saying, you know, all of these, white male, Gen Xers. So basically, like 70% of our market can buzz off. We don't want anything to do with you. In other words, it's really insane from a business perspective. Now, I mean, Nike can succeed by offending people that don't buy Nike sneakers. So they can have Colin Kaepernick as their spokesman, and they're not going to be impacted negatively. But Nike is not going to hire a spokesman who goes out and uh, insults African Americans. They're not going to. They're not going to hire, a racist white guy, white guy to be their spokesperson, because that would alienate their consumers. But what's happening now is so bizarre in the sense that you have companies, corporations, and businesses that are intent on insulting and alienating the only people that keep them afloat. And you saw this with Gillette. Gillette lost a fortune, and yet they doubled down. They said, we're going to, we stand behind these commercials with, transgender shaving kits. And no, just insulting men indiscriminately. And it's really odd. I mean, it's hard to think of a time, if you go back, where you had businesses insulting the people that are responsible for keeping them solvent. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Oh yeah, the Nike story. That yeah, that's actually a pretty. It doesn't get a lot of press, obviously, because the media is slavering over the fact that Nike hired Colin Kaepernick. But yeah, there was a female track star who was basically psychologically abused and manipulated by Nike. You can actually find stories about this online. But of course, I mean, people who actually study this issue, even cursorily, will understand that Nike is a terrible corporation. I mean, they run sweatshops in Vietnam. They the same thing same thing with Apple. I mean, Silicon Valley had a great episode where they were mocking this, where the CEO of Huli, who kind of represents Microsoft, it goes over to a Chinese factory, and they talk about the suicide nets that they have, which is based on what's it, Foxconn in in China. Yeah, the New York Times. Yeah, now okay, now I remember. Yeah, it was the New York Times the docu video series they have, which is actually kind of interesting. I mean, I'm not a fan of the New York Times, but they have that those videos are actually kind of fascinating. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, there's just to go back. You have like I said, you have the sports journalists who are legitimate ideologues who actually are woke. You have the other ones who probably do at least assent to these values, even though they don't think about them or actually think about why they believe them. They kind of just regurgitate them. But their main mission, their main problem is that they're simply frustrated that they can't be real journalists. And then you have a third category, which probably encompasses most of them, who are basically realize that their job is dependent upon them just repeating these talking points and basically going into line. And this is the main problem, because you see this a lot, particularly in countries which are totalitarian countries and specifically communist countries. Most of the people aren't actual communists. I mean, if you go to China, I think the actual number of people enrolled in the Communist Party is pretty small as a percentage of the population, and most of them are there simply to advance their careers. The fact that you need to be a communist in order to glean certain benefits, but it works that way in ostensibly free societies as well. If there's a certain culture, you have to a certain culture, you have to at least nominally assent to that culture's values in order to retain your position and advance. And I think is what um, this is what most sports journalists do. Like I said, you have those two categories. You have, committed ideological, cultural Marxists. You have the woke, the journalists who are woke, at least in a in some nebulous sense. They agree with what's happening, but their real motivation is just frustration that they can't be real journalists. But the biggest group is probably just journalists who are going along to get along, and I think in some ways they're the worst. Um, yeah. A lot of people don't believe in communist countries, don't believe those things. A great book was written by Richard Wurmbrand, who was a pastor and the founder of Voice of the Martyrs. He wrote an autobiography entitled "Tortured for Christ," where he actually describes the mindset, the mentality in communist countries, particularly countries that have been under communist domination, and the impact it has on the psychology. I have a friend, Oleg Atbashian, the guy who created the People's Cube, who wrote a great memoir called Hotel USSR, where he explores the way it kind of deforms people's thinking. But I think that's the main problem you have in terms of the woke sports media. Just people who care more about the perquisites of their job and retaining their livelihood than they do about honestly speaking the truth. And it's unfortunate, but that is the way it is. Yeah, cancel culture. If they canceled Muhammad, they would actually be accomplishing something, which so far they have yet to do. They're not. The fact that the Dixie Chicks are just named the Chicks now, or that Uncle Ben has been erased. These really aren't. I mean, someone was joking on Twitter. They congratulated the Dixie Chicks for abolishing racism. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. on the current situation. Thanks everyone for coming, Alejandro, David, Matthew, and all the others. I see there are a few other people, and I will see you next time.